Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that one material has disappeared. Not oil, not steel, not electricity, but something most people barely think about. And yet without it, factories stop, weapons become harder to produce, trade networks begin to break down, governments panic, and entire industries suddenly have to find an alternative. Now imagine the same thing happening more than 3,000 years ago. Because for some of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, their armies, their tools, their economies, and even their survival depended on a metal most people today couldn't identify if you put it directly in their hand: tin. And here's the strange part. Tin wasn't particularly impressive. It wasn't stronger than bronze. It wasn't more beautiful than gold. And it wasn't even the main ingredient in the weapons that made ancient armies powerful. But mix a relatively small amount of it with copper, and you get something that changed civilization. Bronze. For more than 1,000 years, bronze was one of the most important engineered materials in the ancient world. Swords, axes, armor, tools, chisels, agricultural equipment, and status objects all depended, directly or indirectly, on a metal that many civilizations couldn't easily obtain themselves. Copper was comparatively widespread, but tin wasn't. And that created a problem so enormous that ancient societies built trade networks stretching across huge distances just to keep it moving. Some tin may have crossed mountains, some crossed deserts, some traveled by ship, and some potentially moved thousands of kilometers before finally reaching the furnace of a bronze smith who had absolutely no idea where it originally came from. And if that supply stopped, the smith could have all the copper in the world and still couldn't make the bronze his society depended on. That makes tin one of the strangest strategic resources in ancient history, because the Bronze Age wasn't really built on bronze. It was built on access to tin. And once you understand that, one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world starts looking very different. Around 1200 BCE, something went catastrophically wrong. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by sophisticated civilizations, including the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, Egypt's New Kingdom, and Ugarit. These were powerful kingdoms connected through diplomacy, warfare, and an enormous international trading system. Kings exchanged gifts, merchants crossed seas, and ships transported raw materials between ports. Copper from places such as Cyprus moved through these networks, and somewhere within this enormous system was tin, the ingredient bronze makers couldn't simply replace. Then, within a remarkably short period, much of this interconnected world began falling apart. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes were disrupted, and kingdoms disappeared. The Hittite Empire collapsed, Mycenaean palace civilization collapsed, Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt, and Egypt survived but emerged weakened. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and we still don't have one simple explanation for why it happened. War, political instability, drought, famine, migration, internal rebellion, and the mysterious sea peoples may all have played a role. Most likely, several of these pressures were interacting at once. But there's another part of the story that's particularly interesting if you're standing in front of an ancient furnace. When long-distance trade becomes unreliable, what happens to bronze? Copper is only part of the recipe because you still need tin. And suddenly, the weakness hidden inside one of humanity's greatest technologies becomes obvious. The material powering your civilization depends upon a supply chain, a very old supply chain, and a surprisingly international one. This creates an archaeological mystery that researchers are still working on. Where exactly did Bronze Age civilizations get all their tin? We know they used enormous quantities of bronze, and we know tin deposits are geographically much rarer than copper deposits, but tracing individual shipments of tin thousands of years later is extremely difficult. Potential sources existed across parts of Central Asia, Anatolia, and Europe, and some evidence points toward extraordinarily long-distance connections. This means a bronze sword, made near the Mediterranean, could represent something far larger than one smith's work. The copper might originate in one region and the tin in another, while merchants transport them, sailors move them, middlemen trade them, smiths combine them, and soldiers eventually carry the result into battle. A single bronze sword is therefore almost like a fossilized international supply chain, and if you break enough links, the sword never gets made. But to understand why anyone went through this trouble in the first place, we have to go much further back, because bronze itself was probably not invented the way you imagine. Thousands of years before the famous Bronze Age kingdoms, humans were already experimenting with copper. Copper had an unusual advantage, because in some places it occurs naturally as metallic copper. Someone could find it, hammer it, and shape it without understanding metallurgy. Eventually, people learned something far more powerful. Certain rocks could be heated and transformed into metal. Think about how strange that must have been. You put an unimpressive rock into an extremely hot furnace, and somehow, you eventually extract shiny metal. That discovery alone transformed human technology. But copper had limitations because it was relatively soft. Ancient metalworkers eventually discovered that adding certain other materials could change its properties. Early copper alloys sometimes involved arsenic, and eventually tin bronze became enormously important. Add tin to copper in the right proportion, and you create an alloy that can be harder and more useful for many applications than pure copper. And suddenly, that boring grayish metal becomes extraordinarily valuable, not because people desperately wanted objects made from tin, but because tin unlocked bronze. That distinction matters, because tin was valuable because of what it allowed you to make. Now zoom out for a moment. A smith only sees his workshop, but around him exists an entire economic machine: miners extracting ore, workers processing it, caravans carrying material overland, ships crossing the Mediterranean, merchants negotiating prices, palaces collecting taxes, kings controlling trade, craftsmen turning raw materials into weapons, and armies using those weapons to protect or expand the systems that made those weapons possible. It's a feedback loop. Trade creates bronze. Bronze creates military and economic power. That power protects trade, and trade creates more bronze. Which means the Bronze Age wasn't simply a period when humans happened to use bronze. It was a world increasingly organized around the networks required to produce it, and tin was one of the hardest pieces of that system to replace. And this is the part of ancient history I find most interesting, not just what people built, but the invisible systems that made those civilizations possible. Because once you start looking at history through resources, technology, and supply chains, events you've heard about 100 times suddenly look completely different. So if that's the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. Because we're going to keep taking things that look ordinary today, metals, tools, materials, and technologies, and trace them back to the moments when they changed human civilization. Now back to tin, because its biggest contribution to history may actually have come when the system built around it started breaking. Return to our smith. His furnace still works, his skills haven't disappeared, and there is copper available, but the merchant who normally supplies certain materials hasn't arrived. Maybe the route isn't safe. Maybe the port he traded through has been destroyed. Maybe the kingdom protecting that route no longer exists. Or maybe the people mining the material are dealing with their own crisis hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The smith doesn't need to understand any of this. All he knows is that he can't reliably get what he needs. This is one reason iron becomes so interesting. Iron was initially difficult to produce well, and early iron was not automatically some magical upgrade over good bronze. Producing useful iron demanded different knowledge and techniques, but iron had one enormous strategic advantage. Iron ore is vastly more geographically abundant. You don't necessarily need the same enormous long-distance tin network, and in a stable Bronze Age world that advantage might matter less, but in a collapsing one, it matters enormously. This doesn't mean tin disappeared, and therefore the Bronze Age ended. History is almost never that simple. The late Bronze Age collapse had multiple interacting causes, and bronze continued to be used long afterward. But disruption to the systems that supplied bronze made iron's availability increasingly attractive. The weakness wasn't necessarily bronze itself. The weakness was the network required to make it. And here's the twist. Tin didn't become irrelevant when the Bronze Age ended. Humans kept finding uses for it. Bronze continued to matter, and later societies used tin in other alloys. Centuries eventually turned into millennia, and then industrial civilization found entirely new applications. Tin coatings helped protect iron and steel from corrosion. Tin became important in solders, and eventually it entered electronics. Which means there's a decent chance that somewhere near you right now, there is tin, maybe even inside the device you're watching this on. A metal ancient civilizations transported across enormous distances to make swords now helps connect components inside electronics. Different civilization, different technology, but the same element. So return one last time to that Bronze Age smith. The furnace is hot, the copper is ready, his tools are laid out, he has the skill, he has the knowledge, and he has almost everything he needs, except a relatively small amount of an unimpressive metal that may have traveled farther than almost anything else in his workshop. Without it, there's no bronze sword, no bronze axe, and no bronze chisel. Multiply that problem by thousands of workshops, then thousands of soldiers, then entire kingdoms, and suddenly tin doesn't look insignificant anymore. Gold was more glamorous, copper was more visible, and bronze gave its name to the entire age. But hidden inside that bronze was another metal, a metal that connected mines to merchants, merchants to ships, ships to kingdoms, and kingdoms to one of the earliest truly international economic systems humans ever created. And when those connections became fragile, the civilizations depending on them discovered something the modern world keeps learning again and again. A civilization is only as secure as the resources it cannot replace. Tin never got an age named after it, but for centuries, the Bronze Age couldn't exist without it.